Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Alumni University. I'm Kristen, the Director of Constituent Engagement here at Illinois Tech, and we are so happy that everyone can join us. We're expecting a large group tonight. It looks like we're going to have about 70 people joining us, so thank you all so much. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes for everyone on the call. This presentation, including the chat, is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next couple of weeks. Additionally, if you have any questions for Mindy throughout the presentation, please type them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get them answered at the conclusion of tonight's presentation. So to introduce our presenter, Mindy Pugh, Ph.D., is the university archivist, campus historian, and an adjunct professor of history here at Illinois Tech. She has taught courses in Chicago history, Prohibition history, modern European history, and Anglo-Saxon Britain. She has a bachelor's degree in history from Kalamazoo College, a Master of Arts from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in British Christian socialism, also from the University of Chicago. So with that, I will turn it over to Mindy to get started.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. Can you all see me and hear me? Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out and listening to one of my more fun presentations. And Talon, the hawk behind me, will make sure I do the right thing here. My talk on the old Jazz District, which used to be on State Street between 31st and 35th Street, which back in those days was called the Stroll. It was, for a period of time in the 1920s, the epicenter of jazz culture in the United States. I think people understand correctly that a lot of ragtime came out of New Orleans, but in the 19-teens, a lot of people from New Orleans moved to Chicago for work and other purposes, and I'll get into that in some detail. But by the 1920s, Chicago and the South Side Jazz District was dead center in so many important innovations. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint and start from there. Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much. Yeah, but you should see the first slide before IIT. There is Jazz and State, Bronzeville's Stroll in the Roaring 20s. As I said, we were the heart of the jazz culture in Chicago at that time. The image you see there is of the Vendome Theater, which was, amongst all of that concentric circles, the most important location of jazz in the United States, probably in the year 1926. Thank you. And that is now the parking lot north of the Student Center, the MTCC. It was flourishing in the 1920s, closed in the 1930s during the Depression, and bought by IIT in the 30s and torn down by IIT in 1949 to make room for parking space for quite a while before the MTCC was built there. Just to mention very quickly before we move on from this image, the Vendome is where Louis Armstrong, the famous trumpeter, solidified his mature style, you know, wiping his brow with handkerchief when he was sweating, scat singing, all of those sort of mannerisms that became part of his mature act, he developed at the Vendome Theater. I oftentimes advocate that there should be some sort of a marker there to let people know how important that location was for the history of jazz in the country. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is one of the very few photographs that have survived of the Stroll back when it was up and running. This is looking from maybe, again, that same parking lot north of the MTCC, looking across the street. And as you look through that photograph toward the right, the intersection that you're kind of seeing at the extreme right of the photograph is 31st and State. So this is looking along the west side of that Stroll toward 31st and State. Another one of the important theaters and jazz locations that was on that Stroll was the Grand Theater, which you see there. The Vendome was famous for ensemble work and trumpeting and pianists and whatnot. There were certainly vocalists, but it was more famous for its instrumentalists. The Grand Theater was a great location for the blues singers, Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters, and other famous blues singers, of the Black female blues singers of the 20s. The Grand Theater was eventually bought by IIT and torn down in 1959 for the what's now the Pritzker Center. So just so you know that so much of what we have on State Street is imprinted on top of this old jazz district that we had at that point. Okay, moving on to, oh, and then before I leave this slide, sorry, just go back one, sorry. A newspaper reporter who came down to the stroll in 1926, and of course, this is before air conditioning, and so businesses and entertainment venues would have their windows open for circulation of air and whatnot. So you can imagine with this district that was so crowded with speakeasies during Prohibition and with live music, doors and windows are open. The whole area was awash in jazz music. And one newspaper reporter who went down there to look at it in 1926 said if you held a trumpet in the air at 33rd and State, it would play itself. Of course, he's speaking figuratively, but yeah, you could pretend that trumpet was playing if you held it up. It's quite a different reality now to stand at 33rd and State and hold up a trumpet 33rd and State and people think you're weird, right? But back in the jazz era, you know, what's that, 85 years ago, 95 years ago, yeah, the music was there. Okay, moving on to the next. This is another rare image of what the modern campus looked like back in the late 19th century. Armour Institute was founded in the early 1890s. Main building was the first building built for it, and was the only building for the first 10 years as part of Armour Institute, which later became IIT. This photo was taken from the roof or one of the upper stories of main building, looking toward the east mainly, a little bit northeast, but east mainly. What you see in the foreground kind of leading away from you is 33rd Street. The first intersection, which is in the kind of lower right portion of the photograph, is Dearborn and 33rd, which is now on the II campus, Footlick Lane. And then if you go one further block toward the extreme center right of the photograph, and it's all compressed by this view, you're on State Street. And then at the dead center of the extreme right edge of the photograph, you'll see the L tracks going through. That's about the only thing in this photograph from 1895 that's still there, that we can identify as still being there. And you can see now we have this Miesian campus, which has a lot of green space and open space to serve 21st century clientele. But when Armour was first established in this neighborhood in the 1890s, it was part of a very mid-industrial, primitive transit congested city, where the congestion was not a bad thing, because if there weren't, you know, you only had L tracks and trolley cars, otherwise people relied on foot traffic and walking. So you wanted things to be close. You didn't mind the fact that things were crowded together. It made it easier for you because you didn't have an automobile to get around. And horse traffic was congested in its own way. So this is the near south side at a few, 10 years before the Jazz District starts coming down from further north and coming along State Street and making use of all the shops and apartment buildings that were very congested along State Street and the neighborhood immediately to the west. So that's the old south side. Moving on to the next image. This is right on the cusp of when the Jazz District started to come down State Street. This is taken along 33rd Street looking to the west, taken from the L tracks. Again, the one of the few things that was there then and is still there today. For about, I don't know, 70 years or so, there was a stop at 33rd and State. Now you have to go down to 34th, 35th on the Green Line to get off. But when the L tracks were built through this part of the South Side in 1891, leading to the eventual location of the World's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair, which was down in Hyde Park, they had a stop at 33rd Street. And that stop lasted until about 1955, as far as I can find out. And the reason why there's this photograph is you can see the smoke in the center of 33rd Street. Main building over its life has had so far 4 fires. Fortunately, none of those fires completely destroyed it. But the first one that we know of happened in 1909. It happened in the chem lab, which was in main building. And somebody obviously made a phone call to the Chicago Daily News, which was one of Chicago's early photograph-based newspapers. And they obviously sent a photographer down on the L line. And the first photograph he took while he's still on the platform of the L is this photograph looking toward main building. And you can see the smoke trundling away from main building. So, but other things to observe besides the fire of main building in 1909 is, again, the congestion. Immediately in the foreground to the right is a business and apartment complex, and that's where the MTCC is to this day. And to the kitty corner to it is a series of buildings where the Galvin Pritzker Grove is now. And State Street was at that time even more important than it is today. There were cable car lines up and down State Street from the far south side up to the loop and through the loop and then back down again. In 1906, the cable cars, which were kind of similar to what San Francisco still has, were converted to electric trolley. And so if you look in the dead center of this image, you can see what looks like some sort of a cable or line that goes through the photograph, and that's the electric trolley electric feed. And a boom would come up to that line from the roof of any trolley cars going back and forth. So that's that. So give you a sense of the crowded urban environment that was here, exciting, dirty, loud, all the good, bad, and ugly, but a very crowded late 19th century city that was eventually bought by IIT and cleared out to create something more of a sort of suburbanized campus in the middle of the South Side. Go on to the next image. By the time the Jazz District gets up and running, a matter of fact, the Jazz District is representative of that, there's racial change on the near South Side. There had always been African Americans in the city of Chicago, but they were scattered in various small pockets throughout the city up to about the year 1900 or the 1890s, when the population of African Americans in the South Side starts accelerating and overtaking those locations in the rest of the city. Part of it has to do with rail travel from the South. By 1900, 05, 010, a lot of Blacks are starting to leave the South. Jim Crow, legal and quasi-legal discrimination against Blacks in the South has really reached its completion by about the year 1900. And a lot of African Americans are now leaving the South to go to the North to escape those harsh conditions, and also to find better pay in the big cities of the North. If you were a sharecropper in, like, say, Mississippi in the year 1900, you're getting, if you're lucky, maybe $2 a week for that work. Whereas in Chicago, you could earn, $3 a day at the same time if you're working in the stockyards or other associated meatpacking operations and whatnot. So By about 1910, the South Side is becoming racially integrated in this sort of street by street, block by block sort of checkerboard pattern, as it were. This is the north side of 33rd Street, just west of Footlick Lane or west of Dearborn. The fence is around an Armor Institute athletic field, and Armor at that point was a purely white school. But African-American neighbors would come and look through the fence to look at the athletic events that are occurring at Armor Institute. So there's people kind of the different cultures observing each other, occasionally interacting, but basically just kind of living side by side. So that's the nature of that change. By 1910, as the Black migration, yeah, you can move on to the next image, that's okay. The integration, like I say, or the change in the South Side, the resegregation in the South Side is starting to pick up. And you have not just meat packers and unskilled labor coming from the South, but you have musicians from New Orleans moving north. And they're coming into, and they're moving from the vice districts of New Orleans, Storyville being the most famous one, where there's sort of semi-legalized and protected prostitution in a vice district in New Orleans. And a number of those performers moved to the vice district in Chicago, which is further to the north at about 22nd Street, but still basically anchored on State Street. So you start getting ragtime musicians, pianists, and trumpeters who start moving from the increased Jim Crow conditions in Louisiana and even New Orleans, one of the last holdouts against Jim Crow up until about the year 1900. And they're coming to Chicago for greater economic and personal freedoms. And so they anchor in the Vice District to the north, and then eventually work their way down south. But this whole neighborhood I'm trying to explain to you and picture to you and give you a sense of was a mixture of great architecture and pretty ramshackle architecture. This, you can see in the middle extreme right of this photograph, the street signs saying 33rd and State. This photograph was taken around 1940, just before this building was torn down for Pearlstein Hall. So when you think of Pearlstein Hall and the water fountain and all that sort of stuff, this is a remnant of the late 19th century city that on the near south side, very crowded but vibrant in its own way, that Armor Institute and then IIT was tearing down to be able to create the Miesian campus we have now. Interesting, sort of grocery store with, Coke in bottles and all that sort of stuff, and fresh fruit in crates and whatnot. Okay, moving on to the next image. When I mention more substantial buildings, this is the building that eventually became the Vendome Theater, which was pictured on the first slide, one of the very important jazz locations in the 1920s. That building was initially built by German Americans as an athletic association, and this is the near South Side Athletic Association building, or the South Side Turnverein, circa 1895 or so. It experienced a fire itself in the 19-teens, and when it was rebuilt by African-American business people who lopped off a few of the upper stories and then converted it into the Vendome, which was one of the most famous jazz locations in the 1920s. Okay, moving on. Just to the east of Coast, talking about all these different types of housing and cheek to jowl, street by street, what I call candy striping. This is before the modern era, where we think of neighborhoods as being kind of square or rectangular. Back in the 19th century, people thought more in terms of street addresses and locations. So you'd have one street going for 20, 30, 40 blocks, which could be mansions. Next door, in another street to the east or west, you could have churches that would go for 20, 30 blocks. Another street parallel to it, which might be poor residential. And so all these different realities are living close cheek to jowl. If you went north to south on the near south side, you're staying in one reality. If you go east to west through those different candy stripes, you're getting a real panoply of diversity. So it's the way the cities were organized in the 19th century. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I mentioned the Levee District, which was Chicago's vice district, which was at basically, well, more Dearborn and Cermak Road back in the days that it was flourishing from the 1890s up until it was closed around 1915. To the left is a photograph of that vice district from Chicago. To the right is a picture of a house girl, not here in Chicago, but actually in one of the bordellos down in New Orleans. We don't have the same sort of visual representation that we have from New Orleans, but obviously it's the same business, the same trade. And so all of these upper class and upper crust and educational and down and dirty and everything in between is all concentrated on the south side, which was one of the more varied parts of town. If you really wanted to get entertainment and just a slice of everything, the south side, the near south side is where people are going for it. Okay, moving on. Now, this is a map from a book. It's a biography of Louis Armstrong called Louis Armstrong, Master of Modernism by an author by the name of Brothers is his last name. And this shows the major jazz and ragtime establishments in what came to be called the Stroll by about 1920. Off in the extreme right, you see South State Street. Number one is one of the earliest establishments called the Pekin Inn, where a lot of ragtime pianists were headquarters, like Tony Jackson and Jelly Roll Morton and whatnot. And then getting down to what became the classic stroll at 31st down to 35th. Number 4 is the Vendome Theater. Down to the intersection of 35th and State. Number 10 is the Dreamland Cafe, which was one of the more important ones as well. Most of these at 1920 cabarets and jazz clubs that are along State Street are pretty much, they're all Black entertainers for sure. And most of their audience is pretty much African-American as well. I mean, whites were free to go in there, but they were mainly African-American establishments for African-Americans. What were known at the time as Black and Tans, where it was more socially acceptable for whites to come into that district, were along 35th Street. And you can see, you know, that sort of little outcropping on 35th Street going toward South Parkway, which is now King Drive. Number 14 is the Sunset Cafe, which is still there, but it's now a beauty supply store. Some of you who know the neighborhood and get into the neighborhood might go to that beauty supply store. Number 15, kind of kitty corner across the way, is the Plantation, which is where King Oliver played a lot in the mid-1920s. So you've got the Black and Tans on 35th Street, more racially mixed in terms of clientele. And then you have more Black for Black establishments on South State Street. But a lot of the best music can be found on either the Black and Tans or over on State Street. Okay, moving to the next. You can see Pekin Theater, the image on the very top. That's a very, very early ragtime place that was here even by 1910. And it was at 26th and State Street on the northwest corner. And early in the jazz district, the pianists were ruling. We weren't kind of to the era in the 1920s where the cornet players and the trumpeters and clarinet players were dominating. It was more ragtime piano that was initially brought here. On the lower left, you have Tony Jackson, who by all accounts was a gay Black performer. I mean, he didn't advertise that himself as that. It was a different era, but people recognized his style and that he was different. He wrote a few songs that are very suggestive of same-sex attraction and whatnot. He never cut any phonograph records, and so we don't know what he sounded like, except for the fact that people testify that he was just a totally amazing performer. On the lower right, you have Jelly Roll Morton, who was not gay. He was ragingly heterosexual. Jelly Roll Morton came up from New Orleans, and he had learned how to play a very sort of wonderful ragtime style down in New Orleans, and he brought it to Chicago, and he performed at the Pekin Theater for a while. He had not only learned his style and his training in New Orleans, but a lot of his early performance venues were in the Vice District in New Orleans, in Storyville. And he gave himself his own nickname. He called himself Jelly Roll because, sort of a little warning here in terms of adult language or whatnot. He said, and he was working in a bordello. He's playing in the sort of salons of bordellos where customers are kind of waiting their turn to select girls before going upstairs and whatnot. And he's playing ragtime piano downstairs in the lobby and in the parlor. And he said, he admitted, yeah, in terms of the sex act, Jelly Roll is the most exciting part of it. And so he said, that's the best. That's the best of the best. And so he gave himself that name so that people could understand in a real immediate and crude way that he was the best of the best. And for somebody who, again, learned his trade in a pretty, sexy and crazy part of town, it makes sense. So that's the story behind Jelly Roll Morton's name. If at the end of this, I'm able to share some phonograph recordings from YouTube, we'll do that, and then we'll go to questions, but I'll get through the slides right now. Okay, moving on to the next one. The pace of resegregation on the near South Side picked up in the 19-teens during the war. Cheap European labor coming to the United States was cut off by submarine warfare, but the United States was still a neutral country during the first years of the First World War, still supplying weapons to mainly France and Britain during World War I. So American industry was booming, providing materials for the Allied powers in Europe, but no longer being able to employ fresh off the boat laborers from Europe because submarine warfare and European conscription was keeping those European immigrants from coming to the United States. And so the United States had to really look toward its domestic situation to be able to keep the industries going in the North. You already had what was called a sort of a push situation before 1915, where African Americans are voluntarily leaving the South because they're disgusted with Jim Crow and they want to move north. And then you have a pull situation during World War I, where Northern industries are actually actively advertising down South saying, African Americans, we need you up here to be able to work for good wages in our industries. And so between 1915 and 1920, the Black population in Chicago and on the near South Side explodes for these two causes knit together. The war ends in 1918. There's a temporary economic downturn as industry has to reconvert from war production to commercial domestic production. And it's at that point that a number of white soldiers from the war return, and they notice that their old neighborhoods are changing. There had been a tolerance, quote unquote tolerance, of African-American labor on the South Side of Chicago because of the need for that labor during the war. But a lot of whites assumed that they were only temporary workers and that when the war would end, those people would go back. But obviously the African Americans had had recommitted themselves to the Northern urban experience. And when the war ended, almost all of them were determined to remain in Chicago and to make their home there and to continue to make their home there. And then combine that with a short-term economic downturn. In the summer of 1919, there was a high amount of tension between whites and blacks on the near South Side. And there was, in July of 1919, something that was called the race riot. I think it's equally acceptable, or perhaps better to say that it was a resistance movement. There was a stoning to death of a black teenager on the near South Side who was swimming into what was seen as a white area. And the African-American population responded to defend itself from those racial attacks. And you had an almost week-long insurrection and racial conflict on the South Side, the worst that Chicago's ever seen. And yeah, I saw one of the comments going through briefly about it. Yeah, it was also the year of the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, just a crazy time. And then the same year, 1919, the Chicago White Sox throw several games and intentionally lose the World Series of 1919. 1919 was a crazy year. So anyway, this photograph was taken during the height of that insurrection or that riot. And you're looking at the intersection of 35th and State toward the southeast. Opposite an extreme edge, right edge of that photograph, you would see where nowadays Jimmy John's is located and whatnot. So this is right next to the tower. And in 1919, that was the heart of what was called the Black Belt. The race riot, as the slide indicates, was a demonstration that the black population was here to stay. It wasn't going to be intimidated. It wasn't going to be treated like they were transit labor. They established themselves. They resisted aggression. And the 1919 riot, as unfortunate as it was, established the South Side as an African-American culture and place to live and to work and to flourish. Okay, moving on to the next. I'd already mentioned how the old Turn Shrine was converted into the Vendome Theater. And so by the mid-1920s, it is one of the hot jazz spots. Moving on to the next. After that, this is 31st Street near Mount Olivet Baptist Church. This is the location of the Royal Gardens, later renamed the Lincoln Gardens, which is one of the very first of the jazz culture places. This is where King Oliver played for the first few years before he moved down to 35th Street into one of the blackened dams. And this is where Louis Armstrong joined him in 1922. Move on to the next slide. Yeah, here's some images. To the left, you have Louis Armstrong standing at the shoulder of King Oliver. And to the right, you have Louis Armstrong. And it didn't take long for Louis Armstrong to overshadow his patron and to prove that he was a better trumpeter and cornet player than King Oliver was. All right, move on to the next slide. Once Armstrong is established in Chicago, he becomes friends with Lil Hardin, who was from Tennessee, from Nashville, who is at the piano here. Classically trained, she could play Bach and Schumann and Beethoven and all this, but she moves to Chicago to be with an aunt in the late 19-teens. And she's very, she's only 19 or 20. She's very retentive. She quickly picks up on this new ragtime and jazz piano style. And jazz musicians work with her. And she becomes boyfriend, girlfriend, and eventually husband, wife with Louis Armstrong, who's second from the left. You can see he's being forward. He's got his left foot on the piano bench. I'm hoping they were already married by then, or companionable by then, but he's definitely kind of, staking his claim to Lil in this photograph. This group recorded under different names. Sometimes it was called Louis Armstrong's Hot Five. Other times it was called Lil Hardin's Hot Five. They kind of went back and forth. But that partnership between Lil Hardin and Louis Armstrong in the mid-1920s was pretty instrumental. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah, Lil actually even had a group of her own before she was involved with the Hot Five. And so she had her band at the Dreamland, which is opposite the tower at the southwestern corner of 35th and State. And this photograph here shows how a lot of those jazz clubs were organized. The musicians would be kind of in a balcony or a floor above, and then below you would have the dance floor or tables set up for dinners and whatnot. So this is, during the Dreamland in the early 1920s. Moving away from down to the next one. This is the Mecca Flats, which was built to house people visiting Chicago during the World's Fair of 1893. By the 19-teens, it had become primarily inhabited by African Americans who were working in the Stroll or in the Black Belt. When it was built in the 1890s, it was the largest apartment building in the United States. It was basically like this huge U, and you can't really appreciate it without a sort of an aerial photograph to see just how huge it was. A lot of the jazz musicians who were performing on the Stroll, Louis and the trumpeters and the pianists and whatnot, they lived in the Mecca Flats, and they would have what were called rent parties, where at the end of the month they would, either before they went off to the jazz clubs or after they were back from the jazz clubs, they would continue to perform in their rooms for a while, and people would come over and drop money into a hat, and then the musicians were able to have their rent money for the month. So the Mecca Flats were also part of that whole jazz culture and jazz neighborhood that was there in the 1920s. The Mecca stayed up until the winter of 1951-52. IIT bought it in the late 1930s and maintained it, although didn't actually maintain it very well, but continued to rent it out to the neighborhood until they demolished it in 51-52 for Crown Hall, which occupies much less of that space. But there's one historian of Chicago architecture who said the replacement of the Mecca Flats by Crown Hall is a rare instance in Chicago history where a significant building is replaced by a significant building. Unfortunately, in Chicago history, we have a number of important buildings built by Louis Sullivan, designed by Louis Sullivan and other progressive architects of the late 19th century, that were torn down in the 50s and 60s for parking lots or for bus stations or things of that sort. But the Mecca, which was an important building, was replaced by another important building, Crown Hall. Although obviously the tenants who were evicted were personally disrupted, and to this day there is some discussion about whether IT should have continued a sense of responsibility to the neighborhood, let that building stay intact for the neighborhood. But that's a debate, like I said, it continues to this day. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah, this is taken from the south, and you can see this is one of the very last photographs of the Mecca before it was torn down. This gives you a better sense of how huge it was. In the foreground, you have a museum building, the building at 3410, which is now occupied by the College of Architecture. Okay, moving on to the next. Yeah, lyrics from one of the songs from the 1920s called Mecca Flat Blues, which talks about life in the Mecca. And this is, the singer is Priscilla Stewart, an African-American female vocalist, accompanied by Jimmy Blythe, one of the great Black pianists in that jazz district, along with Jelly Roll Morton and Tony Jackson. And so it's a song about living in this very crowded and busy apartment complex where all sorts of affairs are going on. And she sings about, talk about blues. I've got the meanest kind, mean and disgusted, dissatisfied in mind. My Mecca Flat man, he really don't understand. He's running around on her and this and that. And then the third verse is the singer is accusing another Mecca Flat woman of taking her man, stings like a stingery. Mecca Flat woman, take your teeth out of me. And then the final stanza is, I'm going to find my Mecca Flat man today. And somebody's going to pay for all the trouble that she's suffered. So it's very much content blues, referencing a particular building in the stroll, the famous Mecca Flats. So again, if we've got time at the end, I'd like to play Mecca Flat Blues, but we'll see. I've got to get through these slides. Move on to the next. Here's the interior of the Vendome Theater at 32nd and State. Same sort of thing. You can see the group is upstairs and the tables are set below. Very much a 1920s cabaret style situation. Moving on. I've already shown you this photograph. Yeah, the Grand Theater on the other side of the street. Moving ahead to the next slide. And here are pictures of Bessie Smith and Ethel Waters, two of the prominent blues singers. Bessie Smith died in the 1930s in an automobile accident in, I believe, Tennessee. Ethel Waters went on to kind of clean up her act and almost want to hide the fact that she had been this very sultry blues singer. By the 1960s and 1970s, she's older and she's dowdy, and she is one of the singers at Billy Graham's Crusades. So she did a pretty good job of kind of trying to leave her past behind, but can't be entirely left behind. And I think the Ethel Waters of the 1920s is a more interesting person. Moving on to the next. Here's an interior shot of the Sunset Cafe where Louis Armstrong is performing from 1926-27. He moves on from the Vendome down to the Black and Tans on 35th Street. And he's performing at the Sunset, which Al Capone buys in 1927 and renames the Grand Terrace. Move on to the next. And yeah, this is actually on 47th Street where Louis ended up in 1930, but I won't say anything more about that. Go to the next. Okay. This is, I mentioned about the Dreamland Cafe where Lil Hardin had her operation in like 1920, 21, 22. By the 1940s, the stroll was largely kind of out of business, but there were still some operations that were going. The Dreamland was renamed the Cabin Inn and became famous for not only whatever jazz musicians were still in the stroll by 1940, but also for African-American transvestites, female impersonators who were part of the sort of stage show at the Cabin Inn. So you see some of those pictured here. So that rakish character of this neighborhood, and that's basically where Jimmy John's is today, or maybe just next door to it. That rakish character of that neighborhood lingered into the 1940s. Okay, move on to the next. Yeah, this is Tony's Tavern, which is up near where the Stewart Building is now, 35th, just west of the Stewart Building. On the left side of the table, you can see Louis Armstrong. Closer to the camera is Duke Ellington. So, I mean, best of the best were associated with that neighborhood or would come and visit the stroll when they were in Chicago. Duke Ellington was actually based in New York at the Cotton Club, but he had high respect for the musicians who were here on the stroll on the south side. Moving to the next. I mentioned how IIT bought the Vendome. They used it for a storage facility for a while. On the right is the only color photograph of the Vendome taken just before IIT tore it down in 1949. Move on to the next. This is the Mecca being torn down in 1951, 52. Next slide. This is the Globe Theater being torn down by IIT in 1959. Love the sort of wingback cars in the foreground. Moving to the next. And then here's a picture of Alumni Hall being built in the 1940s on the west side of State. And you can see across the street to remnants of the old Jazz District that were in the next 10 years going to be torn down by IIT as well. Move on to the next. Yeah, this is 35th and State in 1919 on the left. At the right is 1965. at about the time that the IIT Tower is being built. So it keeps a lot of that character of the old South Side up to about the 1960s when IIT builds the tower. Move on to the next. IIT, some people who are on staff and faculty at IIT knew that IIT was sitting on top of something pretty profound. But for the most part, out of sight, out of mind, people forgot about the Jazz District, except for English professor S.I. Hayakawa, who was here in the 1940s. And he was Japanese American. He wrote for the Chicago Defender. He felt comfortable with the Black community. He sought out the remaining musicians from the jazz era who were still in the neighborhood, and he invited them to come on campus and to teach jazz and boogie woogie piano style to faculty and students at IIT. But he was one of the rare professors who actually tried to kind of reach across State Street to commemorate that jazz culture that had flourished in the 20s. Okay, move on to the next. Hayakawa wrote one of the few pamphlets and books about the jazz culture, and you can see by S.I. Hayakawa of Illinois Institute of Technology. I would like to see the university recommit itself to a collaboration of and understanding the history of that district that was briefly represented through the work of S.I. Hayakawa in the 1940s. Move on to the next. And move on from there. It's just kind of some shots of the inside of his article. You can move on from that. Move on from that. And that one as well. Duke Ellington was invited to bring his outfit to IIT for many years. But increasingly, people sort of forgot that he was part of this jazz culture in the 20s that owed a lot to the stroll. This is from the 1962 student yearbook where he's playing with his group for a dance at Herman Hall. Herman Hall opened in 1962. And this write-up, you won't have time to read it. There's no mention of his sort of background from 20, 30 years ago when he was coming to learn the styles from the musicians. And that photograph I showed you 10 slides back of him with Louis Armstrong at Tony's Tavern. It just simply mentions he's a great musician. So the understanding of what that generation of Black musicians had learned and where they had flourished is not understood by mainstream society very well by the 1960s. Moving on. Yeah, this is the Sunset Cafe when it was renamed the Grand Terrace in 1927 by Al Capone. There was a time in 1927 when Chicago Mayor Big Bill Thompson was thinking of running for president. And in order to be acceptable to the rest of the nation, he actually started to try to clean up a lot of the speakeasies, which were by federal law actually illegal. And so he started to raid these establishments, these Black and Tans that up until recently were actually paying bribe money to him to remain open. But there was a period of time where he was sending paddy wagons down to the South Side to show the rest of the country that he was cleaning up Chicago. And Louis Armstrong learned early on that when the paddy wagons showed up in front of the Grand Terrace, he knew that, they'd be carted off and booked and then just released. So he got very good at running into the paddy wagons before everybody else to get the best seat. So that is part of the neighborhood history of Louis Armstrong getting in the paddy wagon outside of the Grand Terrace. Moving on to the next slide. The Grand Terrace closed on 35th Street around 1950. And for many years after that, for like 50 years, it was an Ace Hardware. Some of you might actually remember that Ace Hardware. And then move on to the next. I think the Ace Hardware closed around 2015. And yeah, but during the time that it was I'm sorry, go back one more. I'm sorry. For many years, so if you went into the Ace Hardware, the management there, if you asked, would let you into this office area where you could see some of the paintings on the wall that survived from the Grand Terrace era. Okay, move on to the next. And like I say, the Ace Hardware pulled out around 1915, and it was replaced by this beauty supply store, which is there now, called Urban Boutique. And go on to the next one. And that wall that had been enclosed before is now open. So if you get into the beauty supply store, you can see, these murals again from the Grand Terrace era. They don't like people just kind of coming in to stare at the mural. They want you to buy stuff. So if you go in there, at least pretend that you're going to pick up some stuff. Move on to the next. And I guess that's it in terms of the slides. I wanted to get through those as much as possible. We might be up against a hard deadline, and we might not be able to listen to any music. If we can't, I'll give you a few titles to listen to. But I'm going to kick it back to Kristen right now, in terms of our hard time requirements.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mindy. We can certainly stay a little bit longer if everyone on the call would like to join us.
Okay.
But we do have some questions that came in, so I'd
Yeah,
like
go
to
ahead.
get through a few of them, and then if you want to share some music, do that as
Good.
well.
Great.
So the first question we got was, what do you think is next for the neighborhood?
Well, the neighborhood is changing again, gentrifying. It's probably going to be somewhat more racially diverse, but primarily south of 35th Street, pretty much professional and African-American. So the neighborhood is threatening to maybe drive out some of people who've been there for a long time. We're going to be priced out of living on the near south side by wealthy people who are going to repopulate it for proximity to the downtown. Racially, like I say, it'll largely remain African-American as far as we can project. But a lot of the old churches, Black churches that date to the 1920s and 30s down on 45th Street, 47th, 48th, 49th, that were used to kind of more of a working class clientele, they know that they're not going to be able to serve this more sort of urban professional population moving in that's not as dedicated to the church. I've heard those stories myself personally from people who've been in the neighborhood for many years. So there's the near south side is going to resurrect in some ways by infusion of new groups and greater prosperity, but it's kind of going to change in its character. So I can speak to that issue at any rate. So anyway.
Oh, well, thank you. So John had a question. What about Chapin Hall?
Chapin Hall, that was part of a complex of buildings in the old Armor Institute, which was kind of housing for faculty and staff and some students. It was kind of this entire block from 35th down to 36th, from Federal over to Dearborn. It's where Galvin Library sits now, primarily. It was residential. Armor Institute started to tear some of it down in the 1920s. The part of the building facing main building was left up the longest and was renamed Chapin Hall in the 1930s, I believe, and then was there until it was torn down for Galvin Library in the 1960s. So that's what Chapin Hall was.
Great. I didn't actually know that. So thank you. I've never heard of Chapin Hall before. So thank you, John, for asking. And one of the questions that we got pretty early in your presentation was, do you know, was the original L pulled by steam engine at the time?
Very briefly, very briefly. Yeah. And they discovered, when electrification was even better established, it was better just to run electrically driven carriages along those. But I believe there was a very, very brief period of time where, there were steam engines up there.
Great, thank you.
Shows how sturdy the darn thing must be, right?
Right. That's all the questions that we had in the chat. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, Mindy, if you want to either share some titles or if you wanted to share some of the music that you talked about.
Kristen, thank you so much for helping us get over the initial glitch at the front. Since you're kind of commanding it right now, if you could go on YouTube and type in Jelly Roll Morton Wolverine Blues and then share that. And actually kind of shows a picture of Delaware Morton at the piano on the front of it.
Let me,
Sorry to
here
put you on
we
the
go.
spot, but yeah.
And I hope
There you go.
everyone,
Yeah, before you hit, you got it. Good for you. Before you hit the button, I just want to say really fun. This is a recording from 1926, and it's Jelly Roll Morton starting off the first couple minutes playing ragtime piano like he would have played 10 years before. And then in the middle of the piece, he then breaks into an ensemble and he's joined by a clarinetist and a saxophonist. And then they're showing now this is what we do nowadays with mature jazz with ensemble work. So it's a kind of piece of audio archaeology where you get to hear Jelly Roll playing what he used to play as a soloist, ragtime, bordello pianist. And then midway through, you get the move to mature jazz. It's a wonderful thing. So hit the button and let's listen to the whole thing.
okay, and if sometimes YouTube can be hard to play the sound through Zoom, so I will
Okay.
also include a link in the chat. So if you can't hear it, you can go ahead and click on the link as well to listen to
Okay,
it.
thanks. Great plan.
Can you hear that?
No, sorry, I can't. So yeah, like you say, maybe.
Yeah, sometimes YouTube has rights issues with playing music on
Mhm.
Zoom. So if everyone wants to click on that link and listen to it themselves, it looks like we do have a couple more questions
Okay,
that I
sure.
want to be sure we get to as well.
Right.
So we had, it looks like Marcia had a question. So Marcia, if you want, I can open your microphone and you can go ahead and ask your question. Marcia, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Or was that by accident? May have been by accident. So, well, thank you so much, Mindy. Oh, we do have another question from Tim.
Good. Sure.
Tim, did you want to, it looks like you may have cut off part of your question, but it starts with what businesses or residents along Michigan Avenue? But I think he may have forgotten the end of that question.
Okay. Yeah, well, for many years, the Michigan Avenue mansions were bought by IIT and they survived until at least between like 35th and 31st and 35th on the Michigan Avenue side. They were converted into fraternities by Armor Institute and then IIT from like the 1920s up to about 1960 when they were all bulldozed for the Mies style fraternities that are there now. But a number of those mansions were taken over by IIT and became fraternities for about 40 years before they were torn down.
Oh, perfect. And Tim said that he was actually asking what was Armor Mission, but you actually got to that before he finished his question.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Mindy. This has been absolutely wonderful. Again, if you have any further questions, Mindy, if you would want to put your email address in the chat or I can type it for you.
Yeah, it's very simple. I can even say it at PUGH, just my last name, at iit.edu. That's it.
There we go. Well, thank you so much. And
Thank
again,
you.
this recording will be available in the next couple of weeks. And our next Alumni University session will be October 19th. So we're still working out the details on that one. But please keep an eye on our website and as well as your email for more information about our next Alumni University. So thank you again, Mindy.
You're welcome. Thank you. And Talon says thank you as well.